Hello, let's see. I? Oh, there we are. Hello, welcome to the MichaelSisco Show. I'm your host, MichaelSisco. We have a very, very special episode tonight, kind of hastily put together, but I have two guests, Dr. Clark Carlton and Father John Whiteford. Let's start with Father John's on all the time. I don't know, Dr. Clark Carlton, why don't you introduce yourself for the viewers tonight?
Well, I'm Clark Carlton, and I'm here in my capacity as one of the founders of the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship. In my spare time, I teach philosophy at Tennessee Tech University and have done so for 25, 26 years or so. Um, Graduate of St. Vlad Seminary, but don't hold that against me.
Oh, man. All right, Father John, quick introduction for people who live under a rock.
Well, I'm Father John Whiteford. I'm the priest at St. Jonah Orthodox Church in Spring, Texas, which is a parish of the Russian Church outside of Russia. And, I write and blog a lot and appear on the show periodically.
Hey, what a renowned call-in caller. So it's always a pleasure. So it's good to have you back as a guest. I think you're only your second time as a guest. So good to have you back. So we're setting up Entropy real quick, super chat service. But so you're here to talk. I don't know who wants to chime in, but bringing you on to talk about the Ludwell. I don't even know how to say it. How do you say it? Ludwell.
Ludwell's I've always heard it pronounced.
Okay. So the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship, which I think is launching, your website's coming out next week, from what I understand. So what is that, and what is its mission?
You want to talk about that first, Clark? I think it was more your idea than it was mine.
Sure. Several years ago, a friend of mine from Birmingham, Jeff Condra, we were talking about establishing something like this, inspired by Philip Ludwell III, the story of Philip Ludwell III, to promote missions in the South through the enculturation of Orthodoxy within Southern culture as a means of furthering the church's mission. And as happens, life got busy and we didn't really have time to do anything with it. Then a couple of years ago, I mentioned this to Don Livingston, and he liked the idea and he got interested, and then we still didn't do anything with it. And then at some point, he mentioned it to Rebecca Dillingham, who's like a little Energizer bunny. She took the bit completely in her teeth and just ran with it. Next thing we knew, we had a website going and all kinds of stuff going. So this has been a long time in the making, but thanks to Rebecca's energy, it's finally coming to fruition. So the purpose of the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship, as I said, is to support the church's mission in North America, but particularly in the South, by promoting and exploring the enculturation of Orthodoxy. It's our conviction that the church will never really grow, will never really take root here unless it is enculturated, unless it sinks deep roots into the culture here. And we also think that the South, unique among the American subcultures, is most amenable to Orthodoxy. And this is the most fertile ground for Orthodoxy to grow in North America, which is not to say it can't grow elsewhere, but we think we have a particularly fertile ground, and that's what we're trying to explore with this fellowship.
Okay. So for those who don't know, Philip Philip Ludwell was, I guess, the first convert to Orthodoxy in North America, correct?
As far as we know. Philip Ludwell's grandfather was royal governor of Carolina. His father was a royal official and a Virginia Burgess. And then in the early 1700s, Ludwell went to England and was received into a small Orthodox church there. Had some sort of connection with the Russian embassy. I'm not exactly sure what the exact ties were, but it was a small church in London. He was blessed to return to North America. No church here or anything like that, but he returned to Virginia. And then after, I think it was the death of his wife, he returned back to England with his 3 daughters and had them baptized in the church. He got sick and couldn't come back to North America, so he spent the rest of his life in London as a faithful communicant of the Orthodox parish, and was given an Orthodox burial in London.
Interesting. So that's a, I've heard comment. I know that the Orthodox Church in some parts of the South can be pretty sparse. Hours between parishes, and I think for a lot of at least the perception is that it can be kind of an exotic thing for Southerners who may be mostly part of the Protestant tradition, like Southern Baptist or something. Why do you think it's such fertile ground in the South?
Well, a couple of things, and then I'll let Father John's actually got mission experience. I'll let him join in too. But as far as why it's fertile ground, the South is still the most biblically literate part of the country. Now it's getting less so. I'm finding my students, who are almost all from Tennessee or Kentucky, know less and less, and that's been very noticeable over the last decade. I refer to them as my little heathens. But still, in general, this is the most biblically literate part of the country. You can make reference to Old Testament stories as well as New Testament stories, and the average person on the street is still going to know what you're talking about. The South is, in spite of all the inroads of modernity and capitalism and McDonald's and god-awful Walmart and those sorts of things, the South still has a consciousness of her pre-modern roots. And I just think that makes it more open. Now, as far as being not, sparsely spread out, I certainly understand that. But I think that's part of our mission with the Ludwell Fellowship is not to sell Orthodoxy as something exotic, not to sell it as ye olde worldly religion, but as something that speaks to the deepest religious instincts of Southerners. And it's a bit of a myth. Southerners have never been so somewhat cavalier about church going. And yet, even those in the antebellum period, for example, who didn't go to church regularly thought religion was a good idea, and they supported local churches. There was this sense that there was a strong cultural element to that. And I think what we're trying to do is tap into that so that we're not presenting Orthodox as something foreign, as something exotic, but as something that speaks to the deep heart and speaks to our deepest religious sensitivities. Because somebody's well said that nothing that's truly natural is foreign to Orthodoxy, and that's what we're trying to tap into. Father John, you're a pastor, so.
Well, I mean, one thing I would point out is that if you look at the 2 oldest parishes in the lower 48 states, that would be Galveston, Texas, and New Orleans, Louisiana. And those of both parishes have roots that go back to the 1860s. And the South, I think, has tended to be a more religious part of the country for several reasons. One of which is that it has a pre-modern basis to it that it is tried to retain, although that's been slipping. One thing that I think that what we're trying to do that's important is right now the South is being inundated with people who are refugees from the North and from the West Coast. And I've had several families that have moved to my parish in the last month and a half that are coming from such places, and they're really fleeing, and they're coming to the South, and these are not people with Southern roots typically. And one thing that I think that we want people to understand is there is a reason why the South is the more religious part of the country, and there are things in Southern culture that are worth preserving and worth embracing. And there are a lot of things about it that are very compatible with Orthodoxy, and there's no reason why we shouldn't embrace those aspects of it. That doesn't mean that everything in the South is perfect, but a lot of what the South is accused of and vilified for is actually stuff that was imported from the North after the Civil War, like segregation, for example. There was no segregation in the South prior to the post-Reconstruction New South movement. There was obviously slavery existed and there was subordination, but prior to the Civil War, I can't remember how many freed blacks there were in this country. It was several 100,000 freed blacks, but most of them lived in the South. And there's reasons for why that's the case, and one of them is it was illegal for black people to move to a lot of the northern states and also a lot of the western states, including Lincoln's Illinois. It was in their constitution that black people couldn't move there. And it was also illegal for slave owners to bring their slaves into Illinois for the purpose of setting them free, which is something you don't hear about in the history books today. But de Tocqueville wrote a famous book about America prior to the Civil War. I think it was Democracy in America or something like that. But he noted that when it came to racist attitudes, that places where slavery had never existed tended to have the worst attitudes towards black people, and the South had the best attitudes towards them in terms of being, not hating them, not wanting to shove them off into some corner. And so black people prior to the post-Reconstruction era actually were not excluded from society. Even after segregation happened, there was a lot of legal segregation, but there was a lot of still interaction that went on outside of what was legally segregated. And I remember years ago seeing a documentary about Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter obviously grew up in the segregated South, they were interviewing Andrew Young, who was his ambassador to the United Nations. Later on, he became the mayor of Atlanta. But Andrew Young was talking about how white liberals in the North always seemed very uncomfortable around black people. And it was very noticeable by them. But when they were around Jimmy Carter, they never got that sense. And that's because Jimmy Carter was used to being around black people, as were all Southerners. They always interacted with each other. And so what the South is often vilified for is actually stuff that came from the North that wound up coming to the South. But we don't want to preserve everything that the South has ever had. And there obviously are some things in the South that we're more than happy to let go. But there are good things in the South, and that's why people are coming here. And what we don't want them to do is come here and try to change it and make it into what it was that they left, because obviously that would be a bad thing for all concerned.
Yeah, that happens here in Appalachia too. I like a West Virginian's idea of conservatism is a little bit different than some of the Californian conservatism.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's libertinism coming from California, and they tend to think that that's conservative, and there's a little bit of clashing every now and then.
Right.
But so what is, I guess, what is it unique? Is it that's unique to the South that we can appeal, that the Ludwell ministry can appeal to specifically?
Well, there is a religious sensibility that's still there, and it's not as noticeable inside the major cities as it is when you get a little bit further out. But if you meet people who are really from here and not people who just moved here, you certainly see it. I worked for the state of Texas for, I think, 27 years till I retired from them in 2019. And most of the people I worked with were blacks and Hispanic and females. And when we would have an office party, they would always open it with prayer. And they would often ask me to say the prayer. They would hold hands in a circle and say their prayers. And whenever they would ask me to pray, I would say, well, I need my hands to pray because I would be making the sign of the cross. So I would say an Orthodox prayer and bless the food. But when I first came to work for the state of Texas, I would have never expected that, because I would have figured it's a state agency. Surely they wouldn't allow that kind of stuff. But a lot of these people were deeply religious. They came from very religious backgrounds. And the idea that you would pray before a meal never occurred to them that might be something anyone would object to.
Wow. We do have a super chat from Alexander V.A. I don't know what that means. He says, God bless. Keep up the good work, Michael. Thank you. You found Dr. Clark Carlton. I loved his podcasts. We would love to see more work from him. I think another chat he asked, where can they find your work, Dr. Clark?
Well, for practical reasons, Ancient Faith took down a lot of old podcasts that weren't current. I just got too busy to keep up with it. And to clear room on their servers, they took down them. But we found a bunch of the old ones, and we're actually going to start republishing some of those, the ones that are germane to our particular mission. The first two are entitled The Christ-Haunted South, which goes directly to your last question. You know, O'Connor said that the South was Christ-haunted, not Christ-centered, but Christ-haunted. And even in the worst sinners, there are these haunting echoes of religiosity, of hellfire and brimstone, and that you really just can't get away with. So, but anyway, we're going to start redoing some of those podcasts. We will start doing some new content as well, some new podcasts. I don't know how regular it's going to be, but we will start getting some more new stuff up once the website gets up and running.
Okay, I think somebody says your volume's a little bit low for your microphone. So,
Hi, Mike.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, that's better.
That's better. All right.
Yeah. So the website's going to be Southern Orthodoxy, right? Is that?
I think it's southernorthodox.org, if I remember correctly.
Okay. And is that, what kind of content, what can people expect to find on the website? Like articles?
We're going to have articles, podcasts, videos, poetry. Clark Carlton's going to be having a review that's going to be on there that'll be posting more scholarly articles. Maybe you want to talk about that, Clark?
Yeah, there's going to be a blog, so there's articles. We were designing the website primarily to be almost a clearinghouse for all things related to Orthodoxy in the South, or Orthodoxy and the South. And so there are a lot of repostings of and referrals to other websites. If we see something we like, there's some stuff from, I know we've already got some stuff up from Orthodox Appalachia and the Abbeville Institute and some other places like that. So there's a lot of references. It's almost like a one-stop shopping center. If you're interested in Orthodoxy in the South, you can come to our website, and we'll point you to all sorts of interesting places. Plus, we'll have original content. We will have blog. We'll have short blog posts, and then my little baby that hopefully will get going is the Ludwell Review, which is designed to be a bit more long form essays, a little bit more not scholarly perhaps, but more on the lines of a good quality literary review. And the first issue hopefully will be out next spring. The working title for that is "Regenerate, Not Reconstructed." And we've already got some. David Bradshaw has told me he's going to do an article for that, and we've got some really good people to write articles for that. So we're hoping to hit at all kinds of levels, both popular blog posts, but also things of a little more serious. I'd say intellectual, but yeah, on a little higher level. So we're going to try and hit every area we can to further our mission.
Okay. This thought just occurred to me. Why? You could both chime in on this. Where does that difference between the South and the North, and even I guess the frontier in the West? Where does that come from? Why does the South seem to be so uniquely religious with that, or at least still that religious instinct that just doesn't seem to have the same fervor everywhere else?
Well,
the distinction started the minute people got off the boat. The Virginia plantation, the Jamestown plantation, and the Plymouth plantation were different as night and day. New England was settled by Puritans, and they people who had a sort of messianic form of radical Protestantism. They saw themselves literally as the new Israel. I mean, I don't mean the church as the new Israel, but themselves as English Protestants as the new Israel. And they came over here to establish in New England, a kind of New Jerusalem of sorts. The idea of the shining city on the hill. And then they were so convinced of their rightness that they immediately wanted to spread that as far as they could. So New Englanders migrated across the Great Lakes and then down through the upper Midwest. And that's all under New England influence. At the turn of the 19th century, New England school children were taught to sing a song to the tune of Rule Britannia, only it was Rule New England rules and saves. It was their destiny, they believed, to turn all of North America into a kind of Puritan theocratic kind of system. And of course, the Virginians were in their way. And so we have this total dichotomy between the two. Now, and I think the difference, I did a paper on this for Abbeville years ago, and some form of this will show up again in the Ludwell Review as we go forward. But both the North and the South were largely Calvinist. Both Puritanism is Calvinistic, and Southern religion was largely Calvinistic, because really the hardcore were the Presbyterians. And yet, Southerners were not puritanical, and they were not utopian in their vision. They were much more understanding of human foibles. And I think the reason for that is because we had an agrarian polity, that the South was a culture built around a decentralized agrarian economy, whereas the North very quickly became a mercantile and then later, of course, capitalist industrialized society. And I strongly recommend Kevin Phillips' The Cousins Wars. He talks about the connection between the Puritans and mercantilism and later on industrialization. There's a direct connection between the Puritans in England and the manufacturing centers and the Puritans in New England. And there's a very real economic connection there. And in the South, you had a much more traditional, as Father John and I both said, a pre-modern way of society that's rooted in the earth, that's rooted in our relationship to the earth. You have to live, and you make your living by working with nature, not against it. And I think that that's what really rooted and grounded Southern religion and kept it both A, conservative, but also be non-puritanical. Because what happens when Puritans go bad, I mean, they go completely off the rails, and turn into sort of hyper liberals once, but they keep the self-righteousness. So that's the thing about New Englanders. They've given up belief in God, but they're every bit as convinced of their own righteousness now as they were in the 1600s. So I really think it's the South's agrarian economy, our relationship with nature that is what ultimately grounded Southern religion and kept Southern Protestantism from going off the handle. Almost every weird American sect has its roots in a few square miles in upstate New York known as the Burned Over District. And the South was relatively free of utopian societies. There were a few. In Tennessee, there was an attempted socialist utopia in a place called Rugby, but they were Englishmen who came over here and tried that. But very few. Southerners just don't go for that. Whereas New Englanders and Northerners, one wild fad after another. Of course, that's where the Mormons came from. They come directly out of the Burned Over, Jehovah's Witnesses too.
Yeah, in New England society was very much authoritarian and top down, and the South was decentralized. And as Clark alluded to, what happened was around the time of the American Revolution, these Puritans, their descendants started to become Unitarians, and Unitarians, deny the Trinity, of course. They didn't immediately start denying everything about the Bible like they do today. And basically you can be just about anything and be a Unitarian. So they weren't that far gone back then, but they were heading in that direction. And basically, as Clark said, they lost their faith in God, but they didn't lose their faith that they were the chosen people and that they were on a mission to make everybody else conform to what they believed. And prior to the Civil War, Yankee jokes were commonly told outside of the New England area, even in the North. Like Abraham Lincoln, that was one of his biggest sources of humor, was telling Yankee jokes before the war. But basically, the war allowed New England to assert itself and make itself more culturally dominant than it already had been, and basically to impose its vision of even how we spell English words on the South. And basically it's New England that decided that the word ain't a word, even though it's a perfectly good word. But it wasn't part of the dialect of English from the people that populated New England. So therefore, and actually, I think it was Daniel Webster himself that said that New Englanders spoke the purest form of English there was, even more pure than any dialect of English, including that spoken in Oxford or in the Royal Palace. The New Englanders had the purest form of it, and that's why he felt like his dictionary should have guided the English language, and eventually it did. At least here.
Yeah, I know several prominent political theorists have linked Puritanism to modern American progressivism. Do you see that link? I mean, Harvard was a Puritan seminary, so
there's a direct line from Northern revivalism to the social gospel to progressivism, It's a direct line. It basically, if you lose your faith in God, you stop trying to save people's souls, but you continue to try, if you're an activist, to save society by human means. And they saw education as one way of doing it, but also just imposing their view of Americanism, not just on the rest of the United States, but on the world. I don't watch a lot of these kinds of movies, but I believe it was in Full Metal Jacket where there was a line, and I'll clean it up, but the line was something along the lines of, inside of every Vietnamese person, which is the part that I'm cleaning up, there's an American dying to get out. And they had the same attitude towards the South. Inside of every Southerner, there was a New Englander who were dying to get out. And they figured Afghanistan would be the same. I mean, this you keep seeing this replayed over and over again. But basically, the American empire began when the North invaded the South and imposed its will on it. And then it just continued to snowball, just like Robert E. Lee predicted right after the Civil War was over. He said that he feared that America would be tyrannical at home and aggressive abroad, and that it would eventually suffer the fate of every empire that had come before it. And basically, you're seeing his prophetic words unfolding before our eyes right now.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Gottfried has said that, the modern left is not understandable apart from Christianity, and that's because it is a deformation of Christianity. It's, as Father John rightly said, you take God out of the equation, that leaves you with moral perfection.
Yeah.
And the idea is to look at all the moral reform movements from the 19th century. Abolitionism, and by the way, abolitionism was a very small movement in the North. Most Northerners didn't like Lincoln hated them, and they hated him in return. But abolitionism, the temperance movement, which was part and part of the progressive movement, by the way, the temperance movement, the women's suffrage movement, and I've had students get mad at me when I pointed this out, but the second iteration of the Klan, you can't just talk about one Klan. There have been several Klans down throughout history. The original one ceased to exist in the 1870s. But the second iteration of the Klan, which was founded on Stone Mountain in 1914, 1915, somewhere around in there, was actually the armed wing of the progressive movement. And their strong area was in the upper Midwest. They ran Indiana for a decade at least. And the thing about it is, what did they promote? They promoted public schools as opposed to parochial schools. They promoted public schools. They promoted prohibition. They were big supporters of prohibition. And they supported segregation, which was a cardinal element of early 20th century progressivism. And all of this can be traced back, in this country at least, to New England and to this sort of secularized Puritanism, Unitarianism, basically. So yeah, there's a direct genetic lineage. Of course, progressives don't want to talk about that now, of course, because it's embarrassing, but that's where it comes from.
One thing about the revived Klan that most people don't realize is that it all happened as a result of the first full-length motion picture, which was A Birth of a Nation. So people had never seen a full-length movie before that movie. And so it had a big cultural impact, and you had a lot of what we would now call LARPers that decided, hey, wouldn't that be cool? But the thing that is a very sharp distinction between the Klan as it became with the LARPers versus what Southern attitudes were at the time of the Civil War is there was no anti-Catholicism that was rampant in the South, certainly not like there was in the North. There was not anti-Semitism like there was in the North. And General Grant actually banned Jews in certain parts of the area that was under his control of the military, and Lincoln had to override his order, whereas General Lee had officers on his staff that were Jews, and the largest Jewish military cemetery outside of Israel today is enrichment. So the Southerners had a live and let live attitude. Basically, leave me alone. And we all have rights that have to be respected, and you do you, and I'll do me. That's always been the Southern attitude. And they're speaking of progressivism. There's a very interesting picture of Margaret Sanger giving a talk to the women's auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan that you can find if you Google it. So the progressive connection is definitely there. But of course, the South gets blamed for it, even though in the 1920s there was a Democrat convention where you had a bunch of Klansmen marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, I believe, in Washington, D.C. And what flag are they carrying? They're not carrying Confederate flags. They're carrying the American flag. So you can't blame the South on this one. This was much more of a Northern and Midwestern phenomenon than it was a Southern phenomenon.
Was there I mean, this might not even be a useful question, but the settlers of New England and the settlers of the South, were the Southerners more like Scottish in ancestry, and was there a difference between like the prominent settlers of the South and the New England ones?
Well, of the English that came to the South, they came from different parts of England. There's a book called Albion Seed, which I haven't read, but it's on my list of books to read. But it traces where the various people came from and where they settled in the United States. And you can also trace even accents back to what part of England people came from. And like the word ain't, well, that's traced back to the parts of England that Southerners trace their roots to. But there's certainly a strong Scotch-Irish element to the South prior to the Civil War. And of course, there's obviously a large African contingency, a lot of American Indians, and there's also mixed people. And prior to more modern times, the word colored in the South actually meant people who were mixed, because you had there's certain parts of Virginia, North Carolina, where there's lots of people who are part black, part Indian, and part white. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court case that overrode laws against interracial marriage in this country, the wife was actually part Indian and part black, and I think part Caucasian. And one of the arguments that her attorneys used was that there was no one that she legally could have married based on the law as it stood at the time. So this has always been part of the complexion of the South, and most people don't realize that. They think of it as basically white people and black people only, but it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, the South isn't one culture, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do with the Ludwell Fellowship, because you have the Tidewater area, but you also have the Appalachian areas, and then you have the Gulf Coast, which has a lot of Spanish and French influence, and so the South has always been much more multicultural, to use a popular word today, than New England ever was. Kevin Phillips talks a lot about this, and he's got maps in his book, The Cousins Wars, where he talks about where people come from, because even the names of counties and towns in New England, Middlesex and everything, these are names that come from southeast of England, which was Cambridge and that area, and East Anglia and Essex. These were the Puritan strongholds. Whereas Southerners, you had a lot of Scots. One of my ancestors came to Virginia in 1654 from Edinburgh. So you have a much greater variety in the South, which I think accounts for what Father John was talking about. The fact that Southerners were much more willing to just let people be, had huge German populations running throughout the South. Large
South Carolina was the
in
first.
Savannah and in Charleston and in New Orleans. The first two Jewish senators were from southern states. One was a fire eater from Florida. His name I don't remember. The other was Judah Benjamin, who went on to be Secretary of State of the Confederacy. Bardstown, Kentucky was one of, if not the largest Catholic diocese in the country before the war. Jefferson Davis, whose parents were Protestants, sent him to a Catholic school. So it's just part of the Southern attitude.
South Carolina colony was the first entity that invited Jews to come there after the Ottoman Empire had done so after the Spanish Inquisition. Basically, they had this attitude that, as long as you believe in God and you're willing to respect other people's rights, you're welcome to come here. And so there's a very large Jewish community there that goes way back. And they fought for the South in large numbers. There's a great lecture you can find on YouTube by Michael Kogan on Jewish Confederates. And it's a fascinating lecture to listen to.
In fact, now, I'm not going to state this as an absolute certainty, but I think one of, if not the very first statues featuring a black soldier on federal property is the Confederate Memorial at Arlington. And that statue was sculpted by a very famous sculptor. Oh, what was his last name? Moses Ezekiel, who was a Jewish sculptor, but he was a VMI grad and a Confederate veteran. And he sculpted that, and there are two black figures on that sculpture, and that's the Confederate monument. And I suspect there weren't too many, if any, monuments to black soldiers on federal soil prior to that, and that was the Confederate monument, not a monument to U.S. colored troops, but the Confederate monument, sculpted by a Jewish VMI and grad.
There's a halfway decent movie called The Field of Lost Shoes that's about VMI's actual combat that they engaged in the Civil War. And I think you can watch it for free on YouTube, because I'm pretty sure that's how I watched it. And it talks about Moses Ezekiel. He was involved in the big battle that I can't remember the name of that battle. It's Market something, but it's escaping me. But that's why VMI is the only military institute in the country where, when their soldiers march, they march with the bayonets attached. That's a unique feature of them, because they're the only one that actually fought in a pitched battle.
Well, I have to thank you both. I'm on Wednesday. I'm getting interviewed by Israeli public television, so this is good PR for me for that. So, yeah, I don't know where.
One other thing I would say about why is the South more religious than the rest of the country, and I think one reason is because prior to fairly recent times, the South has been much poorer, and that's because the South was devastated by the war. And also, at the time of the Civil War, about a quarter of the white population was killed. Quite a bit more of it was crippled for life. And a lot of the black population had died during the war too, by starvation, disease, and so there was a sense of tragedy in the South that you didn't have anywhere else in the country, and I think that inspired a deeper sense of religion. If the South had won the war and prospered, it might have become a much more secular part of the country than it did, but because it went through these hard times, it made people dig deeper and get closer to God as a result of it.
Yeah. Well, I guess we may as well broach the Civil War since we brought it up. I obviously I'm sure you're expecting to get some sort of pushback for just embracing Southern heritage.
Right.
It's going to be,
That's because most people have only heard Yankee lies all their life and they don't know the truth. I would encourage anyone who wants to know what really happened in the Civil War to read the text of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, which obviously at that point in his life was the most important speech that he'd ever given. And I'm a fairly above average. I have an above average interest in history compared to the average American, I would say. And I only learned about maybe 3 or 4 years ago that in Lincoln's first inaugural address, he had promoted an amendment to the Constitution which would have protected slavery where it already existed forever and made it unamendable. And this was his attempt to try to get the 7 Gulf states that had already seceded to come back. That's something that you don't see on the Kevin Burns documentary about the Civil War, and it's something you don't get taught in the history classes. Also, the Congress of the United States issued a joint resolution in July of 1861 in which they declared that the purpose of the war was only to preserve the Union and it had nothing to do with ending slavery. And so the idea that the war was about slavery, if that was all the South was worried about, was protecting slavery, they should have said, okay, Abe, we'll take you up on it. You pass that amendment and we'll be happy. But they didn't. And they didn't do that because that wasn't the issue. That was the occasion for a lot of the rhetoric, but it wasn't really the issue. The issue was the North had for decades been trying to become dominant politically, and they had finally achieved it in that election, and they had every intention of shoving it down the throat of the South and making them pay exorbitant tariffs. But Lincoln had no desire to end slavery where it already existed. And the other thing about it that people don't understand is the North never did anything during the course of the war because they were concerned about the welfare of black people. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a threat. If you don't come back by this date, we're going to free all your slaves that are in the areas that I can't control. He didn't do anything to free the slaves that he actually had the power to control. And the threat was, you better come back or else. And the implicit threat that a lot of people picked up on was that he thought that there was going to be a big slave revolt like you saw in Haiti, because black people would get word that, hey, Lincoln's freed us. Let's kill Whitey and take matters into our own hands. And the interesting thing is that even though on many southern farms and plantations the men were all gone and it was just women and old men and children, that didn't happen. Then after the Emancipation Proclamation didn't work, as far as at least didn't work in the sense of bringing about a slave result or making the South come back, although it did work in keeping European powers from recognizing the South, then slavery became a punishment. Ending slavery was seen as a punishment. If you don't come back, we're gonna end slavery, and you're gonna lose all this valuable property that you're concerned with. Then they finally did it as a punishment. But when they did it, they just basically told people you're free, and they did very little to accommodate them. And so there's a really good book called Sick from Slavery. It's published by Oxford Press. It's by someone who's not very sympathetic with the South. But in it, he talks about all the misery that was created by the way emancipation was done. And we don't really know how many people died as a result of it, but we know that there were huge numbers. We had concentration camps, contraband camps, where they were trying to keep freed blacks in one place so they wouldn't flood the North, because the North was very concerned about that. And then after the Civil War, they used every effort they had to keep black people in the South, because the North didn't want them. And so after the Civil War, black people were emancipated, but they were emancipated into a society that was totally devastated, and they didn't have the means to make that emancipation a very pleasant process. And so everybody was dirt poor. White people suffered a great deal, but black people suffered even more because there just wasn't that much to go around. And so for decades, you had malnutrition in the South, just all kinds of problems that resulted from that. And never at any time did the South say, or did the North say, look, if you'll just end slavery, we'll leave you alone. We'll let you be independent, but please send all your black people to the North so that we can set them free. That was never the concern. They never made a serious proposal for here's how we can free the slaves and do it in a way that would not be inhumane. There was actually a peace conference, I believe it was in 1864, where the vice president of the Confederacy met with Abraham Lincoln at Hampton Roads, Virginia. And at one point, the vice president, Alexander Stephens, said, "So what's to become of all the slaves that you want to emancipate?" And basically, Lincoln's answer, to make it short, was he ended it by saying, "Root hog or die." In other words, they're either going to be like a hog out in the woods that's able to get enough food by just rooting around, or else they're going to die. So one way or the other, the problem will be solved. He wasn't concerned about the welfare of black people. As a matter of fact, up to the day he died, his plan long term was to try to ship as many black people to Africa as he could, or to somewhere in Latin America, but he didn't want them in America.
Yeah, if people are interested in these topics, our friends at the Abbeville Institute have just a wealth of information, and we link to some of this stuff. But I will say, though, that the purpose of the Ludwell Fellowship, particularly, though, is to promote enculturation. We're not a Southern apologetical society. That's part of the job of the Abbeville Institute. And Don Livingston is on our board. He's the founder of the one, and he's on our board. As I told Rebecca when I did her podcast beginning of the year, we don't need any other reason for celebrating and embracing our heritage other than it's ours. And we don't need any other reason for honoring our ancestors than they're our ancestors. And so we're just going to do our job. You go to the website, you aren't going to find any articles about the Civil War, although, I mean, eventually we'll put up a few that have a direct connection to Orthodoxy, because I think that is a fascinating subject. There's even a probably apocryphal story that the first shot at Fort Sumter was fired with a taper from the Royal Chapel in St. Petersburg. So, I mean, we'll put some of that stuff up, but we're not an apologetic society. And if people, when they say, well, how do you justify this, that, or the other thing? My answer is I'm just going to ignore that, frankly, myself, because any answer I would give would not be publishable in public. So we can point you, anybody's got questions about that, we can point you to some really good information. And again, Abbeville has some fantastic stuff. But when you come to our website, you're not going to see, War of Yankee aggression, all it's not going to, and we're not interested in being professional Southerners, and defending every little thing about the South. We're interested in doing the hard work of trying to figure out how can we ingrain Orthodoxy within the South so that it will last. The church will never pass away as long as the earth exists. That does not mean that the church will survive in a given location until the end. Churches have disappeared throughout history and will do so in the future. And I think it's an open question whether Orthodoxy will survive in North America should the Lord tarry another 200 years, quite frankly. I'm not so sure he is going to tarry 200 years the way things are going. But I think it's an open question whether Orthodoxy can survive here. And if it's going to survive, and certainly if it's going to flourish, we've got to be rooted in the culture, and we've got to give fertile ground for this to grow, and that's our mission. And we do so unapologetically, both in the sense that we're not going to occupy ourselves with being apologists, but also the fact that we're not going to back down or shy away from celebrating what is true, good, and beautiful in the South.
Good points. Good. Well said. Sarah from Goose here. Didn't realize this was you. Has 3 of your books. So I think we have a couple of super chats I just want to get.
Which we're hoping to get back in publication next year. So this is not 100% certain yet, but Ludwell may actually set up a press through through Ingram POD, and we're hoping to get all of the Faith series back in print, hopefully next year.
Oh wow, that'd be great. Super chat 495.99 from the Artworks VA. We do not want to keep the Southern cotton and slave exchanges, which were closed on Saturdays, I hear. Okay. I don't know what that means.
Probably means something like the Jews. The Jews, would be my guess.
Oh, okay. Trying to get me in trouble, I see. Okay. Martial law for $10. Biblical critique I often see thrown at the idea of excessive multiculturalism is the story of the Tower of Babel. Is this an improper use of the story, or is there a kernel of truth to it? I don't know if that's really on topic here, but I don't know.
Well, the thing of it is if you, in the church, the story of the Tower of Babel is reversed. The curse of the divisions that resulted from that episode was reversed in Pentecost. And so in the church, we don't have these kind of divisions. And so when we're talking about orthodoxy in the South, there's no reason why we would want to make it exclusionary. It would be contrary to the tradition of the church to do so.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, I think, just personally, I think talking about demographics and forced demographic change is another matter entirely. But
yeah, it's a separate question as to whether or not we ought to have 2 million people coming across the border from all over the world without any attempt to mitigate that. And I don't think that that's a good thing. And it's kind of like, we had life rafts that came off of the Titanic, but if the life rafts had all stuck around and allowed all the people on the Titanic to get on board, they would have all sunk. So, I mean, at some point, you can only take so many people into your country before you start destroying the country that they want to come to.
It's almost like, why do they want to come here? Do they not see what's going on? I don't get it.
I, for one, want to build a wall along the Mason-Dixon and prevent.
Yep.
And maybe stop Californians from moving here too.
Well, I'm for a wall, but having a door so we can let the right Californians in, because some of them are not bad people.
I'm glad that I barely meet the criteria. I was born and raised in Maryland. Most of my family is from Mingo County, West Virginia. So I qualified. I got the roots here in the South, but barely South. So glad that I qualify. It's better than Californian, right? So, well, this has been quite an interesting conversation. So I've been very, very pleased. So how can, just to get back to the fellowship, how can people be involved or support the project?
Well, the website hopefully will be up very soon. There've been a lot of teething issues, but hopefully it will be up within a week or so. So it's southernorthodox.org. And go check it out. Eventually, we want to have conferences. We may start with something like an online conference to begin with, but then eventually some on-ground stuff. And we take, what are people interested in? One of the things we want to do is bring people together, particularly in forms of music, because I think this is something that's absolutely essential in North America, is to develop liturgical musical expressions that are both properly liturgical, but at the same time rooted in our experience. Byzantine chant is beautiful. Russian chant is nice. Carpatho-Russian chant is very nice, but we need something that speaks to us and to our culture, but at the same time it has to be proper liturgical music. And so we want to bring people together who are interested in that sort of thing, introduce people who may not know each other, be kind of a clearinghouse of ideas. And send us your ideas, read what we got on the website, send us your ideas. And, we think it's in keeping with our mission statement, then we'll promote that. And we'd like to see architecture, art, promote a truly vernacular architecture. I have a little lost patience with churches that look like they've been plopped down from 2,000 miles away in the middle of Georgia or Texas or somewhere. I think we need architecture that is both identifiably Orthodox, but also belongs where it is, and is vernacular, so that people, again, we're not an exotic ethnic cult. We want to be the church of this place, and for this people. And one other point. Every part of the upper Midwest, every part of America, should be doing the same thing we're doing. Even New England. There's not one America. There are multiple Americas. The South is one of those, and we're trying to do this here. But every part of America should be interested in this very issue of making Orthodoxy a part and parcel of your local place. And so Appalachia will be different from Texas, will be different from the Tidewater. Even when the South, you've got regional differences, and so we want this to be a truly local church.
Also on the website, we intend to give some opportunity for parishes in the South to tell their story, talk about parish histories, and show pictures of churches across the South. So we want to be a place where people can go to find out about Orthodoxy in the South and to connect with it.
All right. So somebody out there needs to start the Yankee Orthodox Fellowship. So.
And there's lots of empty Unitarian churches up there they can convert to Orthodox churches. So they've got a fertile field.
They'll have to be exercised before you can use them.
Yeah. Well, we can reconstruct them, right? Just kidding. So, are you guys? So I don't know how much time either of you have. Are you open to taking some calls, or you want to wrap?
Sure.
Do some final words? Okay. We'll see if anyone's interested in calling in. I'll drop the link in the chat. So we've got the link in the chat if anybody wants to call in real quick with any questions for Father John or Dr. Clark. So I think I'm pretty much, I think we hit everything I wanted to hit, and it was quite the interesting conversation. How much have you gotten any pushback already, kind of behind the scenes for?
Not yet, but I suspect we will get some, particularly once it goes live. But it won't be because of the actual content of the site.
But yeah, it'll just the normal dribble from our culture. Right. So yeah. Well, let's just I guess let's do some final comments from both of you, and then if anybody calls in, we'll take the call, and if not, we'll call it or we'll wrap it up. Because I think I enjoyed both of you coming on, so I just want to thank you both. But why don't we start with final words from Dr. Clark?
Yeah, I mean, there's one Orthodox faith, but Greek Orthodoxy is not exactly like Russian Orthodoxy. It's peculiar to the Mediterranean and to the history and to the social history of those people. Arab-speaking Orthodox is not a little bit different from the Greek, even though it's still somewhat Mediterranean or Levantine. Serbs aren't exactly like Russians, Bulgarians, Romanians are very different. The Orthodox Church has always prided itself on being the local church, of allowing people to express the one faith in a way which is indigenous and is peculiar to them. And mission work is done in Africa this way. If you look at what the Patriarch of Alexandria does in Africa, musical expressions and things like that. North America and Western Europe, though, are two places where we haven't done that. We're expected to simply be, outposts of the old world. And that's just not going to work over the long term. We have the West, as troubled as its religious history is, has a long and deep Christian roots. And if we're going to evangelize here, we have to tap into those. And that's really what we're trying to do, what our mission is trying to accomplish, to look for ways that we can tap into what Richard Weaver called the older religiousness of the South.
Kevin R. in the chat says, if anyone says that Maryland is not Southern, I will fight you. So honestly, I'm from Maryland. I will say that outside of the DC, Baltimore urban and suburban area, it's very, very much like the rest of the South, honestly. The Eastern Shore and Western Maryland, certainly. All right, Father John, final words.
One thing I would just say is that in the Southern tradition, there are a lot of things that are not only compatible with Orthodoxy, but I think they can help us diagnose some of the problems with the culture as it on the bigger scale and what we can do about it. There's Clark mentioned Richard Weaver. He wrote a book that's fairly well known by the name of Ideas Have Consequences. And in it, he does a decent job for a non-Orthodox person of diagnosing where the West went off the rails. He doesn't go back far enough, but he basically traces it back to the nominalist. But the nominalist came on the scene in part as a reaction to the papacy. And so the schism, I think, has a lot to do with why the nominalists came on the scene. And the fact that we now have as many genders as you want, and nobody believes in truth, that there's a direct line from what he's talking about there. And so if you discover some of the better things that you find in Southern literature and some Southern thinkers, I think you can find a lot of good things that can help us as Orthodox Christians engage the culture and try to come up with remedies so that we can preserve the best of the culture and try to protect our families and raise them up in a way that actually produces good, humane Christians that don't fall away from the faith when they get old enough to go to college.
Yeah, okay. Black Ortho Acolyte with $5 says, wouldn't we see growth in Orthodoxy everywhere if the Orthodox would simply go into neighborhoods and give out mass invitations? Seems like Orthodoxy hides.
Well, I think one of the problems that we have with that approach to evangelism is that, if I started, the Pillar of Fire Pentecostal church tomorrow, I could go knocking on doors and pitch Pentecostalism and people would know what I was talking about. But you can't just go hand out tracts and expect that people are going to understand what you're talking about with Orthodoxy. There's a lot of groundwork that has to be laid. And so I think a more effective way of evangelizing is to try to form relationships with people so that you actually have a chance to explain what Orthodoxy is. And as far as Orthodoxy making inroads in different parts of American society, I think it's kind of like getting a beachhead at Normandy. For example, in the inner cities, having worked with a lot of pious Protestant Black people, I know that if you get some Orthodox parishes where you've got a Black priest, and a core group of people, so that it doesn't seem like it's a foreign thing, that it could take off in the Black community, because there's so many things about Orthodoxy that I think would appeal to them. One day at work, I was listening to some Byzantine chant, and one of my Black coworkers walked up and said, "How can I get me a copy of that?" I think there was something about it that made a connection with her, and she just heard it in passing. I could go on and on the subject, but I think that it can happen. Same thing with the Hispanic community. And we're already starting to see some of that happening. It's just a matter of it snowballing. Once you get some parishes, then it's going to be easier to get more parishes, because those parishes will produce clergy that can go start other parishes, and also people who will eventually be moving on elsewhere and want to have parishes where they go. So I think it will start to snowball. The day might come when enough people know about Orthodoxy that you could go into a neighborhood and start handing out tracts, and they would know what you were talking about.
Yeah, that reminds me of a comment that Father Moses Berry made one time. But this is before he was Orthodox, but I think he was at a church, and I think it was St. Cyprian in Richmond. And he walks in, and there was a picture. I guess it was Moses the Black, an icon, and he was just floored by that. That there was somebody who looked like him, looking back at him, from the wall, and that was a major point leading to his conversion. And I said, if we know what it means to be an indigenous Southern Orthodox church, you're 70 to 80% of the way to being an indigenous African American church, because African American culture and Southern culture overlap to such an extraordinary degree. And
it's almost the same culture.
And so I think that this is something that's again, what we're doing can have ramifications for the evangelism for all sorts of people, not just white Southerners, but I think Black Southerners, but Black people in other parts of the country, because so much of the Black cultural inheritance is shared with Southerners.
Yeah, and I think there's something going on, honestly. I don't think it's all that fair to kind of characterize us as not proselytizing, because like I think Father John pointed out a couple of weeks ago, we've seen quite an influx in catechumens, so there's something going on.
Right. And a lot of the catechumens that I have are discovering Orthodoxy online, and there's a lot of platforms that seem to be appealing to younger people that I'm only just discovering. But there's Discord. I just got on it, and I'm still figuring it out, but there's a lot of my catechumens that wound up on a Discord server and started talking with other people that introduced them to Orthodoxy, and then one thing led to another. So it is happening. And I just don't think we can do the door knocking thing at this point, but there are ways that we can do it. And the thing about a social media site is obviously it lacks the direct face-to-face communication, but it does allow you to establish relationships, at least on some level, to where you exchange ideas, and you're able to educate somebody over more than just a brief sales pitch. And that's really what's necessary, because the thing is, because Protestantism is close enough to Orthodoxy in the sense that they use a lot of the same words that we do, but they don't mean the same things very often. You can say what Orthodoxy is, and if someone's hearing you for the first time and you don't have an opportunity to explain what you mean, they're going to think that you're saying things that you're not.
Yeah. I mean, I think like you said, the relationship, just getting somebody in the door, inviting them to church is one of the biggest things you can do. So
Right.
And some people in the chat here are very good at it. Brandon has a new girl in church with him every week. So
having Orthodox barbecues would probably be the most effective way that we could do mass evangelism.
That's true.
Particularly in the South, where people know what barbecue is.
You should have one on my name's day on November 21st, because I think I'll be in town. So
We could maybe arrange that.
let's go. So, but yeah, Brandon says flirt to convert. Do you endorse that strategy, Father John? Flirt to convert?
I wouldn't endorse it as a strategy, no. I mean, it effectively works out that way sometimes because, unfortunately, if you're in a parish that's isolated and there's not a large Orthodox community, if you want to marry somebody, you're going to have to expand your reach a little bit, usually. And it might have the effect of bringing people to the church, but I wouldn't use it as a strategy, no.
Shot down, Brandon, shot down. But it was truly a pleasure, and I hope I'm sure I'll get, once the website's launched, I will get that out through my platforms. But it was a pleasure to have both of you, Dr. Clark and Father John, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners. I don't think I'll be streaming this week for the rest of the week. It's going to be quite the busy week. So, but appreciate all of you watching, and I'll see you next week sometime.